Warning: some viewers may find this content disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised. How to survive camping. I run a private campground. My family has owned it for generations now. It's about 300 acres, most of that shaded by forest and the rest is an open field. We host events, like dog clubs, music festivals, etc. We've also got open camping weekends throughout the year, and in the height of summer we're open full-time for general camping. A lot of people take advantage of that. It's a cheap and pleasant vacation. Hammocks get erected in the trees. Grills get unloaded from the backs of trucks. There's some pretty elaborate setups from the people that come back year after year. The return campers are smart. They know what they're doing. Everyone knows their job when they roll in. They unload as a group. Tents start to go up. Community areas and kitchens go in the same place year after year, where they've found the land suits their setup best. Tent locations might change, but every camper knows where their tent is going in their allotted land. It's a far cry from the disheveled masses that show up and simply expect everything to work out with no prior planning. By noon on setup day, the experienced campers are sitting under their day shades, sipping beer, while the newbies are relocating tents because they didn't leave enough room for walkways. I've tried to help. I put together a guide that everyone receives in the mail once I have their registration info and payment. Sure, the postage is a bit of an expense, but I feel having a hard copy makes them more likely to read it. Not having to fill out as much paperwork with the police is worth the money. I've titled the brochure "How to Survive Your Camping Experience." I wish people would take that name more seriously. The first page is full of practical advice. Stuff like: have a sturdy, waterproof container that holds a spare change of clothes and a blanket. This will ensure you have something warm and dry if your tent floods. Place solar lights near your tent stakes. This will keep people from tripping over them or the ropes at night. If the ground is soft from heavy rain, reinforce tent stakes either by weighing them down or by using longer stakes. They can get pulled out of the ground by a strong wind, otherwise. When planning your camp, allocate 3 extra feet per tent. This leaves rooms for ropes and stakes. The second page is advice more specific to the area. This campsite has been in the family for generations, after all, and a parcel of land obtains a sort of significance when it's been passed down from heir to heir. It is an old place in the world, perhaps not an ancient place, but old enough to have attracted the attention of those things that prefer old places to make their homes. We will have to sell the campsite before it becomes an ancient place, as it will be unusable at that point, but there are still many generations to go before that happens. This is the part that the new campers don't take seriously. They think it's a prank, some little joke of the reclusive camp manager who perhaps doesn't spend much time around other people. The experienced campers try to tell them otherwise, but they don't always listen. I feel my rules aren't onerous. Here's a sampling. If you hear something trying to enter your tent at night, sit up and say in a clear, calm voice that you are not receiving visitors, but it is welcome to visit in the morning. If a stranger appears the next day asking for entrance to your camp, invite them in and give them food and drink. This will give you good luck for the rest of your stay. Fairy rings are generally benign. If there are the remains of a small animal inside the ring, however, inform camp management immediately. Don't follow the lights. I can't believe I even have to say this one. Don't follow the lights. If you see a group of people dancing in a circle around a fire, you may join them. If they welcome you in, dance with them until the music ends. Do not look at the musicians. If they do not welcome you, but instead stop and stare, back away slowly and then leave. If they follow you, you can try to run, but it is likely already too late. Pray that death comes swiftly. I confess it's a haphazard list, but there's a lot of vicious things out there and they all function in slightly different ways. I do some things as part of camp management in an effort to minimize the danger to my campers. We set out traps for the creatures stupid enough to fall into them, so that they can be dispatched by my uncle and his 2 sons. We're closed during Pentecost, on Midsummer Day, and other significant times of the year. But we can't do everything. We can't save people from themselves. Every morning I circle the camp on a 4-wheeler. My staff does the same, a couple times a day. We look for any new developments on the land, a tree that needs pulled down, for example, and campers know they can hail any of us if they need something. I leave directly after I finish my breakfast and a cup of coffee. My house is on the campsite, so it's especially easy for me to take the morning shift. There's never many people awake yet, so it was especially noticeable when I saw a man approaching me ahead, walking down the middle of the road. He looked unremarkable, they always do, but he walked slowly and deliberately, his head bowed so that it was difficult to see his face, and he carried before him in both hands a human skull. I pulled the four-wheeler over and waited, my stomach twisting with fear. Rule number 12, if you're approached by a man offering you a drink from a cup made out of a human skull, accept. It will taste foul and you will not be able to eat without vomiting for the next 24 hours, but this is better than what he will do to you if you refuse. I have drunk from the cup before. It is how I learned of his existence and subsequently added him to the rules. He stopped me on the road and at the time, I thought he was a camper needing assistance, until he handed me the skull cup and bade me drink. I did, as I had already learned that when a being of power asks something of you, it is better to comply. It may not be enough to save you. Sometimes they invite you to partake in your own demise, but the odds of compliance are better. He lifted the cup to my lips and I drank. One swallow. Another. He kept the cup there, his thin fingers brushed my hair back when it slipped past my ear, and I drank it in entirety. The water inside tasted bitter and salty with a vegetal undertone. My stomach twisted and I swallowed hard, struggling to keep it down. "Thank you for the drink," I said when I was done, trying to sound sincere. He knew I lied, for he smiled briefly in wry humor, his dark eyes flashing with cold amusement. "It was wise to not refuse," he replied. He told me what he would have done, had I not drunk, and my insides crawled with horror as he spoke and I wanted him to stop, but to interrupt would have been a dire insult. His words were etched into my memories and for days after I wept whenever I thought of the fate I had so narrowly avoided. I still feel cold and small when I think of the things he told me. That evening, I threw up my dinner. I threw up the crackers I ate. I even threw up water. Finally, I stopped eating and drinking altogether and waited a full day to try again. I was weak and miserable, but I survived. Now, seeing the man approaching on the road, I mentally cursed my misfortune. This was our busy time of year. I couldn't afford to be sick for a day. He stopped just before he reached me, raised a hand and beckoned for me to come closer. He didn't raise his head until I stood just across from him, and when he did, he flashed that thin, dry smile at seeing the expression of dread on my face. "Are you not thirsty?" he asked mockingly. "Not particularly, but if you wish to offer me a drink I will not be so rude as to refuse." My heart hammered in my chest. "Let him release me," I silently pleaded. He put a hand over the top of the skull, covering up the carved opening in the water inside. "Be at ease, I did not come to offer you a drink. I came to give you a warning. Some of your charges have conducted business with the children." I stood there, staring blankly at him in incomprehension. He sighed, almost imperceptibly, and even though his expression did not change I felt the weight of his disapproval when he spoke next. "These ancient beings do not enjoy having to explain themselves. The children with no wagon," he said, speaking slowly, as if that would help me understand. "Someone bought ice from them." "Oh," I said. "Oh God. He won't save them." The man walked past me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he did. "No one will." Rule number 18, you can buy ice from the children that approach your camp only if they have a wagon. Those are the children of other campers trying to make some extra spending money. They only upcharge by a few dollars, so consider tipping. If a group of children approach without a wagon, do not buy from them. Act like they don't exist. They will eventually leave. It wasn't until he was almost out of sight that I realized I didn't have any idea which campsite had purchased the ice, and there were a lot of people here right now. I did the dumb thing. I jumped on the four-wheeler, turned it around, and went after him. I pulled up along the side of the road, a respectful distance away, and called out to him. "Hey, what campsite was it?" He paused almost imperceptibly. "Are you thirsty after all?" he asked, and even though his words were mild, I understood it for the threat it was. "Nope, I'm good, sorry for bothering you." I drove away before he changed his mind on granting me mercy. This was a terrible dilemma for me. I hadn't had anyone buy from the children without wagons before. Most people find their silent stares creepy, and the normal children are pretty aggressive with their ice routes anyway, so that no one needs ice by the time those other children show up. I had no idea what to expect. I had no idea how to undo what had been done. There was, however, someone I could ask. I went to my most senior camp. They're a group of friends that have been camping here for over 2 decades. The members have changed, to the point that the founders have all been replaced, but they've kept the traditions and are willing to work with me. As a result, I've given them the best campsite. It's up on a hill, nestled in a clear spot among the trees so that their camp has shade most of the day, and there's spots to hang hammocks. A gas line runs up the hill, so I have to keep part of it free of trees, which funnels the breeze straight into their camp. It's noticeably cooler there than the rest of the site. It's also the most dangerous. I heard their shouting before I arrived. I slowed, cutting the noise of the engine down enough that I could make out words. I needn't have bothered. It was nothing but cursing. I couldn't tell if it was an inter-camp dispute, doubtful, they kept the drama to a minimum, or if they were angry at another group, plausible, they had a couple feuds going on with the younger camps, or if it was something else. Bracing myself, I hopped off the vehicle and walked in past the line of tents that marked their boundary. There were 5 people in the common area, clustered around the beer kegs. They had a cooler that was outfitted with 4 taps and they ran lines up through a steel plate that was packed with ice, providing access with chilled beer from the tap at any time. The kegs were all homebrew. Right now, they had all 4 taps open and dark liquid was spilling out onto the ground. There was an odd smell in the air that turned my stomach. Like a butcher's shop, I thought, finally placing the smell. Is that blood? I ventured, walking closer. Yes. The woman that did the brewing kicked one of the kegs. All of them are blood. I told them I've come to talk to the thing in the dark. I had a question, I said, and I could also ask about the kegs while I was at it. Sure. She jerked her head at the back of their camp, where the trees crowded in close enough so that their shadows overlapped and the forest floor was noticeably darker under the lattice of their branches. We haven't seen the solars go out all week though, so maybe it's not home. Rule number 10. Keep track of what time the charge on the solar lights typically runs out. If the solars go out before then, do not leave your tent until sunup. Do not open the tent, not even to look. Stay in your tent, try to sleep, and wait for daybreak. I crept into the forest, wincing at the branches that cracked under my feet. Some of the creatures in the campsite were less malevolent than others. So long as they were respected, they wouldn't kill you or even seriously harm you. I'd spoken to the creature in the dark only once before, when I thought to put the senior camp near its lair. I asked if their proximity would disturb it. It replied that they would not, but nor would it hesitate to take any of them were they out in the open when it passed by. I don't know what happens to the people it takes. Their bodies are never found. The entire camp dreams of dying, however, of slow and torturous death in whatever manner they fear most. I dream of the little girl and the beast, and when I wake I know that I'm going to be talking to the police yet again. The creature's lair is nothing more than a mound of broken branches, easily mistaken for a pile of stacked debris. There are some signs, however. The air grows colder as you approach. Sound falls away, encasing you in silence so that the only thing you hear is your own heartbeat. Mine was growing steadily faster as I drew nearer, and it felt like the darkness in between the piled branches was reaching out, gathering up all the light, and dragging it to its doom. Flowers littered the forest floor, the white, parasitic ones with boat heads, feeding on the tree roots running below the barren soil. "Excuse me," I whispered, my voice cracking. I coughed and tried again. "Sorry to bother you, but I have a question." A long silence. I waited, wondering if this was in vain and perhaps the creature wasn't there. Then it spoke, and its words were rough like stones rolling against each other, and I winced in pain, for it felt like my head was between those stones and my skull would crack under their weight. It asked me what I wished to know. I told it about the children. That someone had bought ice from them. And also about the kegs, as an afterthought. "The children are displeased by their lack of prey," it finally replied, and I pressed my fingers against the bones near my ear, as if that could help relieve the pressure. They rejoice at finally being given an opportunity. To do what? The pile of branches shifted. The earth shifted and I stumbled, realizing in sudden terror that that small lump of debris was not nearly enough to contain the creature inside, and it was far larger and perhaps far more terrible than I'd imagined. Its shrug had nearly thrown me to the ground. "The kegs are just the start," it sighed. "More will suffer. All will suffer. And then the dying will begin." My entire campsite was at risk. I felt cold inside. I could evacuate, I thought. I could claim there was something, a gas line rupture? Disease outbreak? There were some options available that would explain why I was throwing everyone out. But then what about my livelihood? Would people return? I'm a little ashamed that greed factored into my choices, but this campsite has been in my family for 3 generations and I wasn't going to ruin it all now. Eliminate the one that started it. The ground bucked, violently, and I was thrown to my hands and knees. Everything else will unravel. I stumbled to my feet, thanking it profusely. I gibbered my apologies for disturbing it and my gratitude for its advice. Then I fled, fighting the urge to look back the entire time. Eliminate the one that started it. Those words rattled around in my head as I went from campsite to campsite, asking if they'd bought ice from the children today. I received quizzical looks from the newer campers, but the older ones answered solemnly, understanding the gravity of my question. They'd read the rules. Finally, I found the camp that bought the ice and they identified the person that had made the purchase. He was elsewhere at the moment, but I could stop by later, they suggested. I said it was fine. I wasn't ready to talk to him. I wasn't ready to take the creature in the dark's advice. I thought, how bad could it be? It was only just beginning. Perhaps I could find some other way to resolve the situation. I spent the evening digging through my books of camp management and folklore, trying to find some sort of ritual or appeasement I could try. Yet the creature had said that the children were tired of not having prey I denied them with my rules, and that this would only get worse and worse until people started dying. That everyone was in danger. Night fell and I reluctantly abandoned my efforts until the morning. My worry made it impossible to sleep through the little girl weeping outside my window and begging to be let in. She's not in the rules. She only harasses members of my bloodline. I was almost relieved when the beast came and dragged her off while she screamed in mortal terror, signaling that dawn was near. I threw on some clothing and jumped on my four-wheeler. I even skipped making coffee. I needed to see what had happened overnight. The man with the skull cup stood on the road, staring off into the trees and calmly sipping the water inside like he was taking his morning tea. I pulled up close by and killed the engine so we could talk. "Skipped your coffee, did you?" he asked. "Want a drink?" "I am quite satisfied, but I will gladly accept if you wish to share," I replied with gritted teeth. That thin smile again. Now he was just messing with me. I looked in the direction he was staring. A slew of people, 12 in all, dangled in mid-air. For one brief, horrifying moment I could only think of the time I'd found someone that hadn't heeded my rules, their gutted body dangling uncomfortably close to my house, like it was a warning. How the police had let me do most of the work getting it down while they waited on the ground with their damned paperwork. I don't make my staff clean up the remains. That's asking too much. These were alive. I almost wept with relief. They'd been pulled from their tents and stripped naked, then taken into the woods. Their bodies were covered with bruises and scratches from being violently dragged across the ground. Then they'd been hoisted up into the trees and left hanging by their ankles from the boughs. "Next time it'll be their flayed skins hoisted in the branches," the man said. "You should end this quickly." "I'm surprised by your concern." "I need people to share a drink with," he murmured. "I can't do that if everyone dies." I had to get my brother and both my uncles to help get the terrified campers down. They didn't fight much while we were doing this, just hung there limply, crying or whimpering softly. It made the job a lot easier. Dead weight is predictable and we could pull them towards the ladder, get a good hold on them, and then cut the ropes and pass them down to the ground. Eliminate the one that started with it. As the abducted campers were taken off to the local hospital for treatment, I delegated the police paperwork to my brother and jumped on my four-wheeler. I returned to the camp that had bought the ice and called the man responsible aside for a conversation. I asked him if he'd bought ice from some creepy children with no wagon, and when he said he had, I asked why he'd broken one of the rules of how to survive camping. It was rule number 18. Hadn't he read it? "Oh," he said bleakly. "That one. Well, there are a lot of rules." I took a breath. Held it a moment. Reminded myself that the majority of people have good intentions and don't do things simply to be contrary or cause trouble. That it is my responsibility as both camp manager and a decent human being to be understanding and help people, because we have a common goal. I want them to have a safe and fun camping experience so they come back, and they want to have a safe and fun camping experience so they can come back. This man didn't ignore my rule simply out of spite. It was an accident. An unfortunate accident. I asked him why he'd glossed over that rule. My tone was polite and friendly without a hint of condemnation or judgment. That's the important bit. People respond in kind. So long as I didn't accuse, he wouldn't become defensive and we could have a productive conversation. I've done a lot of reading on conflict resolution and behavioral change. He hadn't taken them seriously, he admitted. He'd certainly read them. Intently, in fact, because he thought it was a joke, but it was a clever joke and he enjoyed it. But real? Nah. He pointed to his tent, showing how it had 3 feet of clearance between the other tents, rule number 4, and that they'd brought a longer hose so they didn't have to split the closer one more than 3 times, rule number 6. The wool was there. My system was flawed. It didn't change what I had to do. I thanked him for talking to me and walked away. Then I went into the woods and gathered some things. It took a while to find them all, but I'm familiar with my campsite and I know where these things are likely to be found. Then I returned to my house with the mushrooms in hand. They're called Destroying Angel. Amanita verosa. I crushed it and took the resulting juice, careful not to touch it with my bare hands, back to his camp. I poured it into his reusable water bottle, swirled it around to coat the sides, and then left it to dry. They wrote the initial symptoms off as mere food poisoning. By the time his campmates took him to the ER, he was suffering from liver and kidney failure. They did their best, but I had put a generous dose in that bottle and his body simply could not keep up, not even with medical intervention. He was dead within 36 hours. The police dropped by, of course. I talked with them for a bit, we commiserated on how difficult it can be to protect people from themselves, and that was the end of it. They understand what it's like in the forest. I feel I'm to blame. I know rules are ineffective, but they were easy and that's what I relied on. I wrote off the deaths as isolated incidents instead of warning signs that I wasn't doing enough to determine if my rule list and other measures were accomplishing their intended purpose. You know what does help people change their behaviors? Storytelling. It's one of the most effective techniques, far more effective than a list of rules, which according to research is the least effective method, and the most prone to antisocial behavior, which is basically people deliberately sabotaging the system out of spite. Instead of telling someone do this, you tell the person a story that demonstrates the behavior you want. Preferably true, as that carries more weight. And the more personal it is, the more the individual will relate and subsequently accept what you are trying to tell them to do. I'm a camp manager. I don't have a list of rules because I'm trying to ruin your fun. I have a list because I'm trying to help you from coming back to camp and finding your tent collapsed and full of rainwater and having no dry clothes or nowhere to sleep. I'm trying to keep you from spending half a day setting up tents because you didn't plan where everything would go in advance. And I'm trying to keep you from doing small, simple things that could result in a horrific and most assuredly agonizing demise. How to survive camping. Rule number 4, the dancers. I run a private campsite. Every morning I take a four-wheeler out and circle the grounds, before most people are awake. There are some benefits to being an early riser. Solitude. Seeing the sunrise. Finding the human torso lying in the middle of the road before anyone else. Yes. The torso. Just the torso. This was back before smartphones. I was 21. I'd been in my last year of college, finishing up a business degree with a minor in horticulture. The campground was staffed in part by my extended family, but its ownership passed only to direct descendants. My life was planned out from birth and so my degree choice was deliberate. I believe my parents would have supported whatever I chose to major in, so long as I took ownership of the campground, but I've loved this place my whole life and wanted to prepare myself to be the best steward I could. It was the start of the spring semester when my mother forgot to close a window. My father woke in the middle of the night to find a little girl sitting in the mangled ruins of mother's abdomen. Enraged, he seized the girl by her hair and dragged her out the back door and into the yard. She shrieked, she pleaded, but he couldn't be swayed. He threw her to the beast and after it was finished with her, it turned on him. The police found his hand. That was all they found. I know this is what happened because I dreamed of it. It was a true dream. If you've ever had a true dream, you know they feel different, and you know you can trust them. I never finished college. I regret that, some days. I don't need a degree to do my job, but I think it would have been nice to have. There's an empty spot on my office wall. My parents had cleared it before they died so they could hang my diploma there, in preparation for when I took over management. I can't bring myself to put anything else up in its place. I was well prepared to take ownership of the camp despite my age. I'd been training for it my whole life, after all, and I had my entire extended family to help me. So when I found part of a body in the road, I knew what to do. My flip phone's coverage was limited and I couldn't make calls while under the canopy of the trees. Instead, I carried a digital camera and took photos from all the important angles that the police would be interested in. Then I took out the large black trash bags from the back of the four-wheeler and edged the body in. I tied it shut, put another bag around it, and tied it again. Then I hoisted it onto the back of the vehicle and strapped it down. The blood was fresh enough that I could wash it off into the dirt with the couple gallons of water I carried for this specific purpose. Now, I understand that some of you may be astonished that I would clean up the scene of a violent death without first contacting the police. However, my family has an understanding with the police. The campground is important around here. It brings a lot of people in and during the peak of summer we double the county's population. They spend a lot of money on local businesses. A lot of money. The police don't mind if we take certain liberties to ensure the normal operation of the campsite isn't disrupted. It would be upsetting to campers if they came across a dismembered body or an active police scene. I called the police as soon as I was back at the house, and then I started calling family members. I'd only found the torso, after all. That meant there were 2 legs, 2 arms, and a head yet to be found, and I had no idea how many pieces those parts were in. While my extended family scoured the woods for the remaining bits, I could deal with the police. Officer Thomas responded. He'd been helping with our campsite difficulties since before I was born. He's close to retirement now. We sat in my office and he looked through the photos I'd taken on my computer, then requested to see the body out in the backyard. I pulled it off the 4-wheeler and cut the plastic open. Mercifully, the body was still fresh, that it hadn't started to smell of decay, just the sour, meaty smell of early death. Officer Thomas inspected the severed sockets, picking at the edges of flesh and muscle delicately with his fingers, before sitting back on his haunches and stripping off his stained latex gloves. "This is different than the other cases," he finally said. I blinked, taken aback and suddenly feeling woefully inadequate to the challenges of my family's campsite. I'd known that this could happen someday, that I'd be the one to deal with something new moving in, but it was a distant sort of knowledge, the sort that you decide to handle some other day and live in blissful ignorance until that time comes. Like writing a will. We all know we should, but that's a problem we regulate for the future and try to ignore its specter in our present lives. Thomas explained that the limbs were severed methodically. When we were dealing with a wild animal, whether natural or otherwise, the bodies would be haphazardly torn apart. There'd be additional injuries of teeth or claw marks. The torso was otherwise untouched. There wasn't even bruising. This indicated that the victim hadn't even been restrained, at least, not by a method that left marks. The police might not be able to tell us what we were dealing with, but they could help narrow the possibilities. Thomas had brought the police van, so we put the body into a bag and tossed it in the back for transport to the morgue. He asked that we bring the other parts by, once we found them, and they'd start trying to identify the victim. I would also check in with the other campers to find out if someone was missing and perhaps any information about what they'd done or where they'd gone. Then Thomas would come back with some paperwork about a wild animal attack, and that'd be it. We'd lose some campers, of course, once the rumors started to spread. That was unavoidable. Business would be slow for the next year, but it would bounce back once people began to forget that urgent sense of danger and slipped back into complacency. We hadn't formally acknowledged that this was an old land yet. The rules wouldn't come until later, when we had too many creatures that were intelligent or powerful enough to elude our attempts at removal. We found all the body parts by midday. They'd been left deliberately, placed so that someone actively searching for them could find them, but the casual passerby was unlikely to notice. My cousin found the head. She called for me on the walkie-talkie, asking that I come look, and she sounded deeply shaken. My cousin is 2 years older than me. I was quickly finding that having the camp manager title conveyed the perception that I was better equipped to handle anything, no matter how horrific. The head was placed on a stake in the center of a narrow clearing. The ground was spongy, as it sat in a depression that collected water every time it rained. 4 more stakes were stabbed into the earth in a circle around it. I pulled out my compass and checked their orientation. They sat askew from the cardinal directions. I frowned. This was a deliberate perversion. "Look," my cousin whispered, pointing at the head on the stake. "He's still alive." I edged closer, peering at the head. My skin crawled and I felt goosebumps break out on my arms as I crossed the perimeter of the circle. A middle-aged man, perhaps in his 40s. His jaw was missing, leaving behind the upper row of teeth, and his eyes were wide with silent suffering. He blinked. I swore and stumbled backwards. Rounded on my cousin and told her to leave, to go take a break and recover her composure, and then start going around and asking camps if all their members were accounted for. I'd take care of it from here. Perhaps watching my parents die, a silent observer in a dream that felt like reality, had prepared me to withstand this sort of horror. I confess that it angers me, to see someone die in a manner that no one should have to endure, but I've long since accepted that this is life. My world no longer has room for the blissful illusion that humanity has no predators. I told the man on the stake that it would be okay, that I could put an end to this and he'd finally, mercifully, die. A couple tears ran down his cheeks and I saw relief in his eyes. Then I went to the stakes and pulled them free from the ground. After I wrenched the last from the earth, I stood and watched the man's face. His eyes remained open, long past when he should have blinked, and I was satisfied that whatever ritual bound him here had been disrupted. The air felt different as well. Lighter. It no longer pressed in on me. I left the remaining detective work of identifying the victim to the police and the rest of my staff. I locked myself in my office. It was still odd, thinking of it as mine. The marks of my parents were strewn everywhere and I moved slowly in replacing their presence with my own. The books on folklore and camp management were worn, the bindings broken, the pages crumpled and smudged. I wondered how many times my father or mother had leafed through these, searching for answers. Folklore is not a tidy thing. Monsters and creatures of power don't fall neatly into categories. It is not so different from the natural world in this regard. We can look at a bird and know it is a bird, but what kind of bird is it? Bird of prey or waterbird or woodpecker or pigeon or any of the many other types? Similarly, am I dealing with a spirit or a demon or a fairy or a god or something that falls into the gray area in between? And even if I could narrow it down, there were still variations within a category. If we're dealing with an incubus, is it one in the classical sense or is it the kind that attaches only to one person for a life, or is it the kind with chicken legs from the knee down? Yes, chicken-footed incubi are a thing. No, we haven't had to deal with them yet at this campsite. I decided to try a couple things. The use of ritual made me suspect fairies, but the perversion of it also made me think spirits. I gathered up some deterrents from the shed, iron stakes, hawthorn branches, stones with holes in them, that sort of thing. Then, I went about the campsite and left them in strategic areas, mostly at crossroads and along the edge of the designated camping areas. I erred. We were used to dealing with brute creatures that could be driven off, captured, or killed. I don't regret my attempt. It is my responsibility to keep my campers safe. However, I am far more cautious now when I try to drive off something that is intelligent. They recognize these attempts for what they are and take offense at such aggression. That night, I was woken by the sound of someone's voice outside my bedroom window. I'd at least cleared out the master bedroom and made it my own, for my childhood bedroom had been turned into a study after I left for college. I didn't catch the words, for I came to awareness at the end of the conversation. Someone was talking to the little girl that cries outside my window. That made me sit up straight in my bed. Who, or what, would talk to the little girl? Her weeping stopped. There was the soft sound of her feet running in the grass, away from the house. Someone, or something, had sent the girl away. My heart began to hammer in my chest and I quietly slipped out of bed, thinking of the shotgun I keep in the bedroom, wondering if it'd do anything at all. Then my house shook as something slammed against my front door and my back door in unison. A pause. Another impact that rattled the doors in their frames. A third, final impact and the crack and crash of both doors being torn off their hinges. I stumbled out of bed, blind with fear, thinking of how my father had died, how he clawed with his bare hands at the beast's face as if he could fight it off even as its teeth severed his body into two. My hands closed over the shotgun stock as footsteps echoed down the hallway. I stood, turned, and there was a hand against the shotgun's barrel, pushing it up and away, and then another palm against my cheek. "That's enough," a female voice said. She sounded amused. I couldn't see her face in the darkness of my bedroom. "How about you go for a walk with us?" I don't remember much after that. I left the house and I think I told them I couldn't, not without the beast coming for me, and she laughed and said they'd send it away. I'm not sure how many others were with us. Only the woman spoke to me. We walked out into the forest and I'm not certain of the route we took, for it comes and goes as if I were slipping in and out of sleep. When my awareness returned I found myself standing beside a lit campfire, in among a ring of people around it. The ground around me was packed earth. The woman moved from person to person, a ceramic pitcher in her arms. She slipped a cupped hand inside and came up with a handful of water, which she dribbled on the brow of the person before her. Something felt wrong about this ritual. Unsettling. I tried to move or speak, but I found my body was slow to respond to my desires. Finally, she stopped in front of me. "Why don't you join us?" she murmured, pouring the water on my brow. It ran down my face and neck and into the neckline of my nightgown. It felt gritty and I tasted salt when a drop touched the edge of my lip. They began to dance and I was compelled to join them. Step. Turn. Stretch our hands to the night sky, spines arched. Twist and bend. Touch the ground. Then up, a hop, and then the music quickened. And I saw, as we spun, that the music came from a hunched group at the edge of the light. A violin. A hand drum. Something that reminded me of a flute. We danced. My legs began to ache. My breathing grew labored. Bright pain stabbed through my feet and ankles and I thought, madly, that I felt liquid against my bare feet with every step. Still, the dancers continued, their movements growing more aggressive, more frenzied, and I wept and pleaded in broken, panicked fragments for them to release me. They did not. I collapsed before the music stopped. My chest heaved in spastic gasps, racking my entire body with convulsions as it instinctively tried to bring in more oxygen to my battered body. My feet burned, pain shooting up my legs with every beat of my heart. I lay there, writhing in the dirt, whimpering and openly weeping. The dancers clustered around my prone form. One of them crouched and I felt fingers in my hair, close to the roots, and she lifted my head from the ground so that I was forced to look up at her. The firelight was to her back and I could only see her chin and lips in the flickering light. "The little girl and the beast have laid claim to your life," she said, and she smiled, her white teeth shining in the darkness. "None of us will contest their right. However, there is still so much we can do to you before you succumb." She leaned in close and I felt her breath against my ear. Her body smelled of earth and plants. "Don't try to drive us off again," she whispered. She released me, and as a group, the dancers and the musicians turned and walked away. I'm not sure how long I lay there shuddering on the ground. It was one of my senior campers that found me. I heard his footsteps approaching at a run and then he hit the ground next to me, turning me over onto my back. A flashlight shone in my face and I squeezed my eyes shut tight. "Oh, thank God," he breathed. "You're alive." He didn't recognize me. That's not uncommon. I don't socialize with the campers much. I was able to tell him to not call 911, that I was the camp manager and I just wanted to go back to my house and rest. I could take care of myself from there or call my aunt to come help. He deposited me on the sofa in my living room and remained at my house until my aunt arrived. At one point, he asked me what had happened. "The dancers," I said weakly. "The dancers found me." His attention focused on that and he asked a few questions, specific questions. "Weird," he finally said, convinced we'd encountered the same people. "I danced with them a few nights ago. I don't think I've ever felt so happy in my life." Even in my exhausted state, his words triggered a memory of something I'd read. Dancing is used as a cure for supernatural afflictions. The sick individual is sat down in the middle of a circle and the dancers move around them, thereby banishing their illness. Yet something felt wrong about their ritual, from the off-center placement of the stakes to the mockery of anointment. Were they a group of dancers that had been cursed? Were they demons enacting their own, abhorrent, version of the same ritual? Without being certain, I didn't dare try to drive them off again. However, I at least wanted to understand the difference and why one person had survived and another had not. I could convey it to my campers, somehow. I had not yet written my rules, but I had a vague idea that perhaps I could inform them so that they would know of the hazards. We already spray-painted the poison ivy patches fluorescent pink. Telling people to stay away from the dancers wouldn't be too dissimilar in theory. When the wounds on my feet were healed enough that I could walk, I went out into the forest after the sun had set. I wasn't concerned about the beast. It stayed close to the little girl and the little girl never went into the forest. I drove about on my four-wheeler, searching for campfires. There were many, but the later it got the fewer remained to check. Finally, sometime after midnight, I found the dancers. They moved in a slow, sinuous circle. Their movements were languid, the music slow, their shadows stretching out into the darkness beyond the orange glow of the campfire. I killed the engine and walked down through the thin line of trees to the clearing. The music stopped as I approached. The dancers turned to stare at me and while I couldn't see their faces, I felt their hostility. The woman stepped out to meet me. She was short, I noticed, not even my height. She stood out from among the other dancers, tall and lean, and I wondered if there was a reason for that or if it was mere coincidence. "You should go," she said evenly. "You aren't welcome." "I figured as much," I replied. "I'm not ready to leave yet, though." Her hand snapped up. She grabbed me by the neck, raising her arm up, her fingers digging into my tendons. "What are you trying to do here?" she hissed. I stood on tiptoes, trying to ease the pressure on my throat. "Finding out what prompts you to kill people." Her eyes went wide. She stared at me incredulously for a moment and then let go of my neck. I stumbled backwards, coughing. She laughed, a high delicate sound like the chime of a bell. "You take advantage of your immunity from death," she said in amusement. "I like your boldness. I will tell you. Knowing what displeases us won't be enough to keep people from resisting the temptation of joining in our dance." "They had to be welcomed," she said. "Permitted to join." She would not elaborate on what sort of person they would welcome and who they would reject. "There wasn't any sort of criteria," she said with a shrug. "They just knew who they liked. As for the other offense that would merit someone's death." She directed me to look at the musicians. I did. They raised their heads and looked back at me. My next memory is of being on my knees, my fingernails stained with blood, the skin around my eyes and down my cheeks burning from where I'd clawed it raw. The dancers were gone and mercifully, they'd taken the musicians as well. I don't leave the safety of my campers entirely up to themselves. I do what I can. Sometimes I take risks and sometimes I suffer for them. This is my responsibility as the camp manager. We do the hard and dangerous work to make sure you have a pleasant and safe camping experience. The least you can do is follow the directions that I suffered to obtain. Rule number 4, if you see a group of people dancing in a circle around a fire, you may join them. If they welcome you in, dance with them until the music ends. Do not look at the musicians. If they do not welcome you, but instead stop and stare, back away slowly and then leave. If they follow you, you can try to run, but it is likely already too late. Pray that death comes swiftly. How to survive camping when it rains. I run a private campground. I have a set of rules to ensure my campers have a safe and enjoyable vacation. Last time I told you about the dancers. Let me tell you what happens when it rains. There aren't any rules about the rain. I cannot possibly make a rule set to encompass all potential threats. Our world is a dangerous place. The books in my office are filled with sticky notes marking the pages for everything from invasive beetles to the causes and cures for werewolves. I could not hope to condense this much information into a simple list of rules, especially since I already struggle with getting people to read the ones that already exist. Instead, I target the most immediate threats. The ones that I know exist on the campsite and that campers are more likely to encounter than others. Since the majority of my campers stay under their shelters when it rains, I don't have to worry as much about them encountering one of the things that come out during storms. The campers stay in one place and drink, and the unnatural creatures of the woods tend to avoid large groups. They prefer to prey on lone individuals wandering through the trees. Most of these creatures leave when the rain stops. There are a handful, however, that do not and have to be dealt with by camp staff. It rained last week. A few days ago, one of my camp staff showed up at the office with a rather shaken camper in tow. Our campsite was mostly deserted at this point, as our big open camping event had ended and we were prepping for our next wave of campers. Just a handful of people, families and couples wanting to get away for a few days, nothing organized like our events. My employee told me that he'd been clearing out some of the underbrush that posed a fire hazard when he'd heard some shrieking. He'd gone to investigate and found this young man on the ground, pinned by a woman, a naked young woman with green hair. They're called Rocky, singular Rusalka. I've also heard them referred to as water spirits or mermaids, but with legs instead of a tail. They originated in Russia. They don't need the ocean to appear, any body of water will do, even something as small as a puddle left behind after a rainstorm. She was in the process of tickling him to death. If you laughed just now, stop and think about it for a moment. Imagine what it's like being tickled to the point you feel you can hardly breathe and your stomach and chest aches with exhaustion. Now imagine that doesn't stop, it keeps going and the pain just gets worse and worse until your lungs seize up and you pray that darkness sweeps you away just so it'll stop. Imagine how long it would take to die in such a way. If you're not ticklish, the Rusalka merely finds a convenient puddle of muddy water and shoves your face in it until you drown. Unless it's one of the northern variants. Those smother their victims with their breasts. If you're thinking, that's a great way to die, I should add that their breasts are iron and I suspect it's less smothering and more crushing their victim's face and skull into a pulpy mass of flesh, but hey, I only know what the books told me. I haven't actually seen a northern variant kill someone. All of our four-wheelers are outfitted with useful supplies, both mundane and occult. This particular staff member had paid attention during orientation and the bi-yearly refresher meetings and knew to grab the branch of hawthorn before charging at the Rusalka. She snapped her head up, her beauty vanishing as her face contorted into a grimace, her lips peeled back and her gums protruding, her eyes nearly swallowed up in the puffy folds of flesh. My employee averted his gaze, flailed a bit with the branch, his words, "Not mine," and she fled. Then he'd helped the camper up onto the back of the four-wheeler and brought him to my office. I called the police so that they could talk to the victim and take his report and tell him they'd press charges once they found his attacker. It makes my campers feel safe. The police just throw their reports in a special file back at the office and never touch it again. Dealing with the Rusalka would be my job. To do that, I would need some help from my staff. I have a new employee. I'll call her Turtle, since that was part of her username. She's an internet hire. I don't typically do internet hires. I recruit locally, as my campground's support of the community is one of the reasons the police are willing to work with me whenever an accident occurs. However, there is a lot of value to be found in bringing in outside ideas, so when Turtle made a good suggestion and said she was between jobs, I brought her on. I was also short-handed at the time, even before Jesse was put in the hospital. I've been doing something new. Ever since the man with the skull cup spoke with me about the children selling ice, I've been making a point to greet him when I'm out on my four-wheeler. Interesting fact about the man with the cup, it isn't always a man. Some people are approached by a woman. They look like a different person to everyone that encounters them, and I haven't been able to find a pattern to their gender or appearance. However, I only see him as a man. I'm also encountering him more often. I wonder if this is because I'm actively looking for him, as before now I was dreading his presence. It's a calculated risk. I wanted to learn more about him and what he knows about this campground, but he isn't willing to forego giving me a drink every time we meet. One time I wasn't thinking things through and took a drink from my water bottle to get the bitter, salty taste out of my mouth and wound up puking beside the road while he watched. It felt like he was disappointed in me. About 2 weeks ago we heard someone scream over the radio. We all carry one. I asked everyone to check in and Jesse was the only one that didn't respond. I told my staff to group up and start searching the campsite in pairs. Then I left my office to go check the land around the thing in the dark. I don't ask that of my staff. I didn't get very far into the woods before I noticed the man with the cup standing by the side of the road. I stopped and asked if he knew where Jesse was. "Back there," he said, nodding to the trees behind him. I offered her a drink. She accepted, but she wasn't polite about it. I left her impaled on a tree branch. So after that I was desperate for extra staff and Turtle seemed like a good fit. And she has been. It's working out so well, in fact, that I thought I'd give her a bit of extra responsibility. I called Turtle to my office and asked if she could wear something nice to work tomorrow. "It's not some weird dress code thing," I hastily explained. "The ritual requires a maiden to be dressed up, and while we didn't have the right clothing, indeed, I don't even know what it should look like because the book didn't describe it, I've found that substitutions can be made. It is the symbolism that matters. Clothing that is reserved for special occasions would signify that this is a matter of elevated importance, thereby conveying ritual status to what we were going to try." Turtle stared blankly at me when I finished. She seemed open to strange things when I hired her, but I think this was a bit beyond what she'd anticipated. Generally, when a boss tells a female employee that they should be ready to throw their clothing at a murderous mermaid in case things go horribly wrong, that's going to merit a sexual harassment lawsuit. However, this is an old land, and things are a little different here. As with any supernatural creature, there are a myriad of ways to banish a rusalka. There's also a number of different ways to protect yourself against one. We were going to try a fairly simple ritual, in which a young lady is dressed up and sent out into the woods. She is the avatar of the rusalka, and her symbolic banishment from the village, in this case, the staff lodge, would transfer onto the rusalka and banish her from my campground. If something went wrong, Turtle could buy herself time to escape by throwing her clothing at the rusalka. They're obsessed with clothing. They desire it more than anything and will stop to pick up and put on any article of clothing thrown their way. I showed her the route to take on a map. She'd start at the employee lodge. All of the staff would be present to see her off. She'd walk through the woods, all the way to the opposite property line. It's about a half-mile walk. I'd be waiting there with the four-wheeler to take her back. "That's it?" she asked, somewhat surprised by how easy it sounded. "Well, if it goes wrong you might be running that half-mile," I said. "Just be ready to throw something behind you to slow her down. I don't recommend throwing your shoes. The road turns to dirt at the base of the hill and there's a lot of rocks. You'll want your shoes." She agreed with my advice and said she'd wear a cardigan over the dress and throw that first. The next morning Turtle showed up in a sleeveless mint dress with a lace overlay. A neat white cardigan and running shoes completed the outfit. She looked uncomfortable and understandably nervous. I left her with the rest of the staff, reassuring her that this would be fine, that I'd be there waiting for her at the edge of camp. Then I got on my vehicle and headed out. My staff relayed what was happening via radio. They told me that Turtle had left the lodge and they'd seen her off. That the rusalka had apparently been lying in a ditch near the edge of the field, wallowing in the remaining rainwater, perhaps, and snapped to attention as Turtle walked by. That the rusalka had then slipped off into the woods after her. "Well, that's not good," I said. "She's got a cardigan," someone offered hopefully. There wasn't much I could do except wait. I kept track of the time. I had a rough idea of how long it would take someone to walk this far, and then I added another 5 minutes past that. After that, it became apparent that something had gone horribly wrong and Turtle wasn't making the rendezvous. I started the engine on my four-wheeler and began driving slowly down the dirt road, listening intently for the frantic cries of someone being tickled to death. Instead, I heard a bird call. Okay, it wasn't a bird call. It was a human voice yelling caw-caw at me in an attempt to subtly get my attention. It wasn't really that subtle. Turtle? I asked hesitantly. Yes, she hissed back. She was hiding behind a sizable tree. I watched as she poked her head out from behind it. I don't think it worked. The Rusalka wound up chasing me. I did what you said and threw my clothing at her. Are you at least wearing? No. I had to throw all my clothing away before she stopped. So she was not wearing undergarments. With that question answered, I went to fetch something from my four-wheeler. While not ideal, it would at least let me get her back to the employee locker room. It's not in the rules, but I'm thinking of adding it. Always carry a spare tarp. They come in handy if the rain does something unexpected, your tent fails in some way, or you need an emergency cover-up for a naked employee. I dropped her off at the employee lodge, and once she was dressed, we reconvened in my office to discuss what went wrong. The Rusalka had come at her as soon as she entered the woods, Turtle related. There'd been a gleeful, almost childlike expression on her face, but Turtle wasn't going to take chances that the Rusalka wouldn't hurt her. Which is good. I think Turtle is going to work out as an employee. She'd thrown her cardigan and the mermaid had stopped to pick it up and put it on. Turtle had run for a bit, trying to put distance between them, but she was quickly winded and had to slow down into a brisk walk. From behind her she'd heard someone humming, growing closer, and when she turned the Rusalka was only a few yards behind. There was a smile on her face and an unnerving intensity to her gaze. Turtle had kept walking, unzipping the back of her dress as she did, and then she stripped it up over her head and tossed it back to the Rusalka. Inside out, which probably bought her a handful more precious minutes as the mermaid struggled to turn it right side out again. And so it went. Turtle would gain some ground, the Rusalka would catch up, humming the entire time, and my newest employee would discard another item of her dwindling wardrobe. I should have worn more layers, Turtle sighed. It was like the worst game of strip poker, where the loser dies at the end. Finally, the Rusalka had seemed content with the clothing she'd put on, or perhaps she got bored or distracted, for the humming ceased, and when Turtle turned around that last time she discovered she was alone. Then she found a tree to hide behind and waited until I came looking for her. I'm still not certain why that banishment failed. Perhaps because it's used to remove a Rusalka from around a settlement, and my campground includes forest, which is where Rusalka are traditionally banished to. Regardless, I needed to attempt something else. There's another ritual we can try, I said. I explained what we'd do. Turtle went pale. Her eyes darted sideways, gauging the distance between her and the door. She didn't need to have worried. She's a good employee, after all. I had her handle procuring the supplies we needed, the wood, the gasoline, the drugs from the pharmacy. They know how my campground works and are willing to fulfill special orders. She even took on the task of slipping the pills into Jesse's water bottle while they were both in the camp break room, which surprised me. Jesse didn't make it very far before they kicked in. She'd been cleared to return to work, but she still had stitches in and wasn't moving very fast. Turtle, bless her, tried to catch Jessie when her knees buckled, but Jessie was flailing a bit and she went down hard. It was an embarrassing scene, her rolling around on the ground, gasping and screaming, and her camp uniform getting stained with blood from a broken stitch in her stomach. We dragged her back into the break room and I had a couple more female staff members. I felt it was proper to respect her dignity as much as we could, help me strip her and dress her up again in another one of Turtle's dresses. It didn't fit that well, but it didn't matter. She only needed to be wearing it for as long as it took for her to burn. There's another ritual to banish a Rusalka. An effigy is created to resemble the Rusalka, dressed in clothing it covets, and then burned. I was going to use something a bit more significant than a crudely bound bundle of twigs. You see, the man with the skull cup said something else that had me concerned. He called to me, as I was hurrying into the woods to locate Jessie and get her to the hospital. Her behavior reflects poorly on you, he said. If it happens again, I will hold you responsible as well. I fear the little girl and the beast above all because that is the most likely cause of my eventual demise. However, after what the man told me he would do, if I ever refused to drink. My parents didn't exactly die quickly, but they still died better than what the man promised. We took Jessie to a clearing in the woods where a pile of firewood waited. Jessie cried and fought the whole way, but the drugs made her uncoordinated and weak, and it was like the tantrum of an infant. We dumped her on that first layer of wood and then heaped more up and around her so that she was partially buried, emptied a couple cans of gasoline onto it, and then I lit a twisted knot of newspaper and tossed it on. Jessie went up like a candle. Her screams didn't last long, but they were piercing, the shrill, agonized terror of someone not wanting to die like that. She writhed, jerking convulsively, before falling still, and her form was obscured by the thick black smoke from the burning gasoline. Most of my staff have seen something terrible before, so they were merely unnerved. Turtle seemed the most bothered, staring firmly at the ground until one of the other staff members gently took her arm and suggested they go back to the break room and dispose of Jessie's old uniform. I've slipped an excerpt from the employee handbook into her locker, just in case she forgot about our healthcare plan. She's entitled to a free monthly counseling session with a local therapist who knows about the campsite and will accept stories of demons and monsters at face value. It's the least I could do, really. I don't think Turtle will have to help me with something so unpleasant for a while, though. I wasn't listening to Jessie scream. I was waiting for something else, the sound of a second scream, coming from somewhere off in the woods. An echo of Jessie, that same helpless, desperate cry. I'm not sure if anyone else heard it. It died away shortly before Jessie succumbed. The Rusalka isn't dead. She's merely banished. Regardless, it'll be a while before we have to deal with her kind again. I run a private campground. It's a little different from others, where the people aren't intrinsically tied to the land and there is no significance in the trees and the earth. Perhaps you think I'm cruel in how I literally fired an employee that refused to respect the creatures of the forest, but being disrespectful of ancient beings is a serious transgression and should not be taken lightly. I saw the man with the skull cup today. He smiled at me, and this time, it was neither mocking nor condescending. I think he approved, and his approval means safety for me, for my employees, and my campers. And that's what I'm here to do. Keep all of you safe by any means available. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more daily videos, and join the Spooky Squad.